today and for everybody to joining us as well. Really appreciated. We do enjoy talking about the slightly crazy and in some people would say unusual world of reform that we're sitting in at the moment. So I'm Paul Harwood, Director for Partners and Places with GBR TT. I'm on loan from Network Rail, been here just over 3 years now, on secondment from NR. The Partners and Places side of it is a remit that's orientated towards pretty much everything in terms of external engagement around reform and the GBR TT activity. Predominantly focused was originally on operating contracts, so with the operator world, supply chain side of things as well, private sector delivery there, and lots of work on the nations and regions activities, so mayoral combined authorities and the like. I'm joined by Michelle. Michelle, do you want to go for your intro?
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Michelle Nolan-McSweeney. I'm a non-executive director of the PWI. I have been so for a number of years now. I'm ex-NR, previously in different roles in capacity around training, safety and so on. But I'm now semi-retired, but in that time that I find myself free, I am the GBR TT Safety Policy Lead, and I'm also the design sponsor, and I'm here to support Paul in the presentation today.
Brilliant, thanks Michelle. And what we're going to do, we've got a little bit from me first, then return to Michelle, then back to me, and it should give us plenty of time for questions at the end. So we'll see how we go. We just get the slides up. Try and avoid death by PowerPoint too much, but we shall go for it. Right, GBR TT. So we were formed in November 2021, Great British Railways Transition Team, after the Williams report was published in May 2021. It was like a long time ago now. Pretty much with, simplified slightly, but two primary objectives. One is to design and prepare for GBR, which was obviously a journey that was started a number of years ago. And the other one was make a difference in the meantime, which is very much try to work out how to get the industry working together under the principles of what GBR was intended to be, at the time guiding mind, now directing mind, to try and enable some of those improvement opportunities and value add opportunities that are there to be delivered before we get to the GBR position. So that's the plan. A little bit more on GBR itself. He says, trying to get the slide to move. So there it goes, quite to plan. There we go. Right. So we, as all good organisations would do, set ourselves a mission as well. Summarised there, very much focused on what you would hope to be focused on: customers, sustainability, making the railway sustainable in the broadest financial sense as well as the environmental sense, cutting complexity and collaboration. And back on those last 2 points, then we come back to our mission on the left there, which was very much trying to keep a simple mission in mind all the time and constant challenge. That was creating a simpler, better railway for everyone in Britain. And we gave ourselves the challenge to challenge on that simplicity point all the way through our 3+ year journey to the point we are at the moment. Just a little bit more on GBR TT itself as well. It's an arm's length, it was a temporary arm's length body set up to manage, effectively drive the change through a small change team, small being probably averaged about 200 people, a number of consultants involved at various times as well, which reflects that number, lots of co-working with various different parts from the people from the industry, organisations from the industry, but set up to drive that change in partnership with the department. And something I always mention that I'm really proud of is what we set out to do and have done throughout that GBR TT life so far, is have a really diverse mix of people from a proper diverse range of backgrounds and diverse organisational construct as well. I think we had something like 21 different companies represented in organisations across the industry at a point in time. That tends to change relatively short term because we're all sick on these in as well. But creating that environment where diverse thinking, doing things differently and representing all parts of the industry was absolutely critical at GBR TT. And we cling hold of that because that's a key part of the journey through to GBR. What have we been doing? Well, it's been a bit of a slaloming journey, as it won't surprise everybody. Sort of full steam ahead in late 21 into 22, and then the path over a couple of years, I will summarise very quickly, was dependent on the political agenda at the time. To an extent, we keep getting to Bradshaw address points where there would be a real surge of progression and interest. Anyway, but we were making progress all the way along, work on design that Michelle will talk about a bit more in a minute as well, and that mission to try and make a difference as we go along, which links back to some of these points. On the timeline, pretty much that gets us to, it was November 23 that we realised we were going to be going into a year without any legislation run up. So we had the election ahead of us, where we sort of changed the remit a bit and focused very much more on some of these activities, because we stopped or slowed down our design activity because there was no point in progressing it before we got to the election, because of any risk of change of direction thereafter. So November 23 was quite a critical point. We thought that would probably take us about a year through to something like October, when everybody was guessing it might be an election. Of course, it was a shorter period of time through to July. But quickly running through these things, what have we been doing? Quite a diverse mix, but things that generally speaking have been well supported and are all within that mission of trying to get the industry working better, that whole GBR agenda. Starts off in terms of revenue, and some of the origins of this are in the Rail Revenue Recovery Group that was set up during the days of the pandemic. So before GBR-TT was set up across industry group, trying to work out how we recover some element of that revenue that we all know we lost over the pandemic, and some of that revenue that is linked to fundamentally different demand that we predict going forward, and how we can actually get that revenue up or contributing to that multi-billion-pound financial gap we have in the industry compared to the pre-pandemic position. So a lot of that's focused. It's the usual. There's a constant theme about working together. This is working with some initiatives that RDG already had underway. Then we launched a number of different rail sales. I think we're on to our third rail sale now. Booking with confidence. Some of that was around building back up confidence in the industry, particularly over the time when we had industrial action and people were feeling that they didn't have confidence and reliability in the provision of that journey. So it was around reminding people options that were there, how we can travel, making it easy for make the decision to get back to using rail again. So massive effort there about increasing revenue. We have the passenger revenue optimization plan, which is a broad reaching plan, again foundational for the industry to an extent, spanning all different parts around basics of like improving performance right the way through to the ticketing and availability of information to help people make decisions to use the railway. Second point there, industry financial model, again, a core part of it. And when I've presented before to organisations that realise the significance of this, when they think about trying to run their own company with income and expenditure kept separate and not having whole system decisions taken, we realise the significance of this and the significance of it for the journey to GBR. So what we've been doing is working up and back into a whole industry financial model. What surprised a lot of people was that was using publicly available data, but nobody had actually pulled it together, tried to analyse it and turn it into a useful decision support tool so that we can start to get the industry focused on integrated financial decisions rather than separated and silo-based ones. A long way to go on that one, as there will be on most things, because some of the financial constraints across the different component parts are still there, but at least to try and use the information available to help make a better decision across the whole system. Third point I've already referenced, and again, we're trying to drive some of this through GBR-TT itself. So a real adherence to and belief in a diverse environment with recruitment, engagement, retention, focus to try and create that diverse team, to create that diverse thinking. We think we've done quite a job to inject that into an industry that everybody will probably recognise has challenges from a diversity perspective. So as we said, the stats say considerably different than public sector averages. Some would say that's relatively easy when you're talking about a few hundred people in a team. That is true, but if you don't get the foundations right, I suspect we will struggle to make the difference we need to in the future. Fourth one there, digital rail experience. You've probably heard quite a bit about this fares, ticketing and retail program we have, which is a separately funded program of work itself. So beyond the change activity that GBR-TT represents, very much consistent with direction travel around, and a lot of this is around the pilots with our combined authority partners as well, to try and make the ticket buying process considerably easier. So pay as you go, tap in, tap out, using modern ticketing technology behind this as well. And it's in the next one as well. Using some of the data sets. In fact, the next one down there about fare reform is all around trying to get respond to what passengers tell us day in, day out, week in, week out. The fares are complex. It's not easy to work out if you've got the right fare. They're difficult to navigate and then difficult to buy across multiple different platforms. So that collection there is all about trying to address what we can now to make that better and easier for customers. Culture change linked back into that ED&I position as well. It's about getting that culture change in the industry. I've got a network rail background. Some of what culture change means for me, I think in that space is around commercial awareness, which we see with our working with the operator world for many years. They feels like they have a slightly different commercial perspective driven by their private sector background. We need some of that in the industry as one of some of the different culture measures and culture factors. And one of them, which is almost in a sense is made difficult for people, and therefore they culturally shift away from it, is that whole system decision making. So it's quite a shift to get back to that again. Rail freight, freight is another area we focused on. One that's very, very widely supported is trying to get the industry pulling together behind support for freight. We set up a strategic freight unit, works very closely now in conjunction with Network Rail's system operator Freight World. And one of the key factors and delivery factors there is the work we did with the department over the end of last year, I think it was, to get the industry behind a rail freight growth target. So there's government policy to support that. 75% figure quoted there. Inevitably, some will say that's not high enough. Some will say, is it too high? Is it achievable? A lot of work behind what the options are to try and support that. But to me, the critical part is we've all got behind the need for a targeted activity and support behind that for increased use of rail for moving freight around the country, something that is very clearly signalled and necessary from a GB economy point of view. Second to last one there, simplifying track and train. And some of you will have been involved in this over a number of years, where the industry has tried to have alliances, collaboration activity to try and join up some of that track and train decision making. We've targeted areas in particular. Anglia, we were already doing some work on before GBR was set up. The South Eastern Alliance between Network Rail, Kent and the South Eastern organisation, where there's very strong alignment in geography and service operation side of things. We're already making a lot of progress on trying to get, before we've got the full impact of reform and the simplified environment to work in, you can still do quite a lot to try and join together those track and train decisions. The Simplification Commission work there as well, that's all around responding to processes that I'm sure a lot of people on the call will be frustrated about. Some of the industry processes, great example is things that we do at stations, station change. The process in place around those regulated processes are there for good reasons, to protect people, particularly from a commercial perspective. But one thing they do is make it very difficult to deal with the industry and very difficult to make good, pacey decisions, too often with the outcome being it takes a long time to improve things. So finding ways we can unlock those things before we get to the GBR position. The final one there is drawing some of these things together. Again, it's about trying to work through and get better information to the industry around consequences of industrial action. So that's linking some of the revenue points together with the industry financial model to try and help understand and communicate to an extent as well to inform the debate that went on outside of GBRTT about how to tackle that industrial relations issue. So a variety of things there that we've worked at over time while also working up the design principles. Slight shift to pace. So another thing we've been working on is around the GBR HQ and Rail Campus Derby. This is something that goes back again a couple of years now. There was a competition to work out to establish where the Great British Railways headquarters will be based. Derby was a clear winner. There were 42 entrants to the competition. Really good support from a number of different cities. But Derby was a clear winner, both from a point of view of the criteria. A lot of people will know it's a very strong, I think it's the largest rail cluster in Europe by some values. So it's a huge railway environment already there. But so from a criteria point of view, the votes and the effort put in by Derby City and the wider East Midlands area was impressive. This is a shot from a few weeks ago where we had the launch of Rail Campus Derby. So that's the point I want to draw a distinction between the two. The headquarters is a location. The Rail Campus concept is about how you can get more value out of that and use a cluster type approach, things that broaden out the reach and make a JBR headquarters there, not just an introverted building that a number of people work on, but part of collaboration, innovation, sharing hub in some way, shape or form in the Derby area. We had over 200 organisations at that launch day, a wonderful lining up between the previous Secretary of State, I have to say. Of course, this presentation was pulled together last week before things changed. But it was a great joining up there. So we've got Secretary of State in the shot. We've got a couple of MPs, Derby North, Derby South, Baggy Shanker and Catherine. To his right, to his left, sorry. On the far right-hand side of the shot, you've got Nadine Peatfield, who's the Derby City leader. You've got the East Midlands Mayor as well, Claire Ward, in there. So there was an amazing putting together and consistent belief in what we can do at Derby as part of that GBR HQ journey that we're on. GBRTT has itself got a small office in Derby now at John Ellis House, which is next to the station. And we're already trying to do what we can with the relatively small facilities there to both build upon the concept that people are trying to get behind of what Rail Campus means and use it as a centre for a lot of collaboration and understanding so that we can then test how that could grow into what is a campus concept. Won't surprise anybody, a lot of the themes are around shared space, visibility, shared information, breaking barriers down, less confidentiality, or get the confidentiality right when it's necessary. It's something I keep reminding people. Competition doesn't necessarily mean you don't talk to each other. There's a lot of principles there behind what we're trying to achieve at our campus derby. So that's looking good start. One other point I wanted to make, things that we'll be doing, is about our supply chain commercial partnership sounding board, and purposely use the title of commercial partnerships because there is a belief, this is after talking to the supply chain reps for a number of years now, and particularly with the perspective of talking to supply chain reps not as the client, so as somebody that's trying to get the environment, the design for the industry into a place where the value that I suspect a lot of people would believe is lost in the current environment. That's not for the want of trying a lot of organisations. But if we even just go back to the financial decision making being in silos, it is very difficult to innovate, particularly from a technical innovation perspective, in an environment where those barriers are there. It is complicated. The value chain doesn't stack up. So what we wanted to do was, and we listened to the supply chain, and they said, basically speaking, their view of the industry, rather summarised, is too slow, too siloed, and too prescriptive. We won't get into those factors now, but they also said the industry has a habit, and a lot of this is targeted at NR as one of the biggest clients, of being very selective in how it engages with the supply chain, very much a one-way conversation rather than a two-way conversation, so information provision, but only when it feels like it. Sounds a little harsh, but we've very much heard this from a lot of supply organisations. So we wanted to set up the sounding board as that vehicle for engagement with the supply chain, predominantly to talk about design as design is evolving. Now, we set this up a couple of years ago. Design obviously didn't progress as far, but we believe that when we get back onto design under the SGBR environment that we'll talk about more in a minute, this method of conversation is going to be critical for that. What is this method of conversation? Well, we wanted to be quite different. So we have originally set it up with 10 supply chain reps. Now we have 12 selected on a rotating basis, so in the region of 6 monthly stints. And those organisations volunteer to be part of it, and we literally do a technical version of it, draw names out of a hat. So we have no control over who is sitting around that table. We rotate it, as I said, at broadly 6 month intervals. We have observers around the table as well, but that's usually the trade bodies, the likes of RSG, the trade bodies of RIA and Rail Forum, the Department for Transport there, and Network Rail are there. But that's very much in listening mode to those supply chain representatives. The only sifting we do is across the size of organisations to make sure we have small, medium and large enterprises, and particularly that SME voice, often a feeling of not being heard. And sometimes the particularly tier ones tend to drown out the conversation. That's not a gimmick critically to them. That's just the nature of the industry as it currently stands. We wanted to make sure we had a really diverse mix of people there as well. And actually on that diversity, having complete vulnerability and not having any control over who we choose to come along has created a greater diversity of representation around the table as well, which probably says something if when you choose or invite people, you get representation more akin to the industry's makeup at the moment. You go a bit more vulnerable on that one, don't control that, you get a much more diversity input to that conversation. So we're going to keep that running. We're really proud about that at the moment, but that's some of these principles. In fact, and one of the reasons why it's so critical is a statistic we keep reminding people. We've worked out that even with public ownership of all the train operating companies, we reckon about 60% of industry expenditure will still be with private sector through competition. So it just says about getting that partnership right. It is critical because that's where a lot of the value sits as well, rather than just the 40% or approximately 20% of the expenditure that's on sort of industry delivered, public sector delivered activity. Sometimes I believe that we don't quite get that balance right and pay attention to our partnership working with our supply chain colleagues. That gets me to my handover point. So, Michelle, I shall flip up the next slide and over to you.
Thank you, Paul. So, Paul said earlier, the 2021 Williams Review was there. It was recommended that we would set up Great British Railways as a new public body. So, Great British Railways Transition Team was established as a legal entity in 2022. And you can see the bullet points there, the roller coaster ride of on the timeline of various things that have happened. But it's fair to say that in much anticipation post the Bradshaw address in Feb 23, when Mark Harper was very clear on the reform agenda, that we had high hopes of legislation being passed and anticipated that we would see in the King's speech in November 23 an announcement with a view that we would see GBR stood up for May 2025. That didn't come to pass, and so a lot of the design work that we'd done up until that point, so we had a target operating model design and signed off by GBR Exco, GBR-TT Exco for approval. We were in a position where design was paused, but the work carried on. So as Paul has just alluded to all the excellent activity that's continued, but the design itself, as in where we were going next, was temporarily paused. So fast forward to 2024, rail reform is firmly on the agenda, but we now need to operate in a different space. So getting Britain moving, a change of government with the Labour Party, public ownership bills, Paul said about passenger services. We've got the railway bill to go through, the railway reform bill. So that will be when we will see the change from approach of Great British Railways as a guiding mind to Great British Railways being the directing mind, and effectively the English devolution bill, which is also significant in terms of deeper levels of devolution potentially for enhanced mayoral authorities and so on. So lots to happen. So even in that design space that we were in 2021, 2022, 2023, we've now moved into a different era in 2024. Where we're now talking about what will that look like for a GBR stand up in whenever. So next slide, please, Paul. We are now progressing GBR design. So effectively in three key areas, we are looking at inputs, ways of working, and output. I'm the GBR design sponsor, so I have oversight of core business processes. So earlier Paul talked about achievement and activities that we've been delivering as GBR-TT. Those are core business process areas that we've looked at, so value chain, so things like the industry financial model, one railway team, stations management, and so on. So effectively on the left hand side we've looked at all the inputs, so design principles, key assumptions. We've developed briefing packs. We've not lost sight of the fact that we did some very good design work back in 2023. And now we're moving forward. So we're looking at ways of working. It's very much that collaboration space. So as Paul said, GBR-TT is made up of a large number of people from different organisations, but we're now working through Shadow GBR with DFT, DHL, NR colleagues, supply chain colleagues, train operators, and so on. So it is much more of a collaborative space, whereas I perhaps would have said maybe a year ago it was more of a cooperation. I would definitely say it's now much more of a collaboration. In terms of outputs, the intention is that we will develop priority processes. We've got a series of working groups established now. There are 16 core business processes that we'll be going through, and they will look at the decision making, the interfaces, the role of government, the role of governance. What would it look like at a network-wide level? What would it look at a local level? What would the interfaces be like with combined mayoral authorities? What capability will we need in the future? And it's all driven through a benefits outcome design approach. So policy papers on key design questions are being developed as we speak. So what does the corporate entity look like? What would be your operating model for day one? Would it look different for your end state when GBR is stood up in 2 to 3 years time versus 3 to 5, 5 to 7, etc. So a lot of activity going on, but we are working towards the railway bill being laid before Parliament in summer 2025. And the question then is, how soon would we then stand up GBR for day one? Next slide, please, Paul. So as you can imagine, having been the safety policy lead and in my previous life in Network Rail as head of corporate assurance and accident investigation, we are naturally keen to make sure that we look at this and change management through a safety lens. There's lots of these slides I could show you. I'm just showing you a snapshot of an activity, but effectively at stage one, so through today through to stage two, we are undertaking safety assurance activities through a safety assurance working group, which is made up of industry-wide participants, subject matter experts, folks from DHL, Network Rail, rail partners, safety forums, people that can contribute to make sure that actually as we make the changes that we control the change, so that actually people aren't in a position where we find ourselves making a change to the detriment of current safety. So the overall strategy is dependent on active consideration of safety as the reform proceeds. So it's not wait to design, decide if it's safe, and then move forward. It is about proactively looking at the design throughout. So we've got a bunch of working assumptions. We've done a review of the design proposals, including what an end state could look like. We have a risk register. We're now at version 3 of the issues log. We will review that in the light of the sector target operating model, which is much wider than just GBR. That will play into RSSB, RAIB, the ORR, economic and safety, potentially a passenger service authority. So that review is far wider than just GBR in terms of its own target operating model. And then we're looking at specific risk and mitigations, as you would imagine, with a view that DFT and GBR safety specialists assess emerging proposals, take them to the safety working group, and we work through the conceptual design, optioneering, what that might mean for a target operating model, and so on. At stage 2, we'll get to a point where we're in detailed design, hopefully summer next year, spring, summer next year. We would have then a clear steer of what the legislation might look like from a consultation document, and then that's where we would proceed to another level of critique and detail, but at this stage it's fairly high level, but concentrating very much about making sure that current organisations that are duty holders are not taking their eye off the ball, and we are making sure that that safety assurance continues throughout the change period. Thank you, Paul. Over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Michelle. Right, just final couple of slides. This one summarises a few of the things that both I and Michelle have said. When I talked to the comms team the other day about slaloming journey, they took me literally and put a slide together with a slaloming journey on it. But so we talked about quite a few of these things, but I just wanted to focus in particular. So we get to the SGBR mobilisation point in the middle there. As Michelle said, that was sort of quite a change of model. So we were in an environment for a number of years where we were trying to, Michelle, perfect word, of cooperating with the industry, but it was driven by a smallish change team at arm's length from. We're now in the environment where SGBR has mobilised, so that was the previous Secretary of State, has remitted Network Rail, DFT, and that's the delivery part of DFT, and DOHL, and DOHL as going to be the recipient of the public sector operating companies in due course, which we'll get back to in a second, to work together to actually deliver that reform and also drive opportunity and improvement in the meantime before you get to that GBR position a few years away. So that was mobilised, stood up. You'll have heard Laura Schoaf is the chair for that SGBR organisation. So it's those 3 organisations together. It's not a company or anything like that. It's a collective of those organisations, but with a chair and a series of priorities that we'll talk about in a second. Public ownership bill. So that was one of the fastest things I've certainly seen in the industry, was you have the King's Speech one day and then you have the very first bill put forward by the new Labour government the following day. This progressed through Parliament now. Royal Assent was last week, so the public ownership bill is now concluded. We haven't seen the implementation plan associated with that yet, but as it suggests on the next block along there at the talks, it's expecting from spring 2025 the remaining private sector held operating contracts are going to move back to or move to the DOHL organisation. The DOHL organisation is expanding as well, because effectively it's going to become very quickly the largest owning group we'll have ever seen, and it's not set up for that at the moment. That will happen over a period of time. I think that 3 years is tended to be used. It depends a little bit on the core contract terms for the operators and other conditions that the government have said that they might look at in terms of successful delivery of the service or failure to deliver the service. But that's the plan coming together. So the moving fast and fixing things of the previous Secretary of State is coming real there. And Michelle's alluded to it. So then we also have the other bill, which is a railway bill. Consultation documentation of that is being developed. What I suspect, it's no secret that although it was expected to try and get that out before Christmas, before the end of the year, with the new Secretary of State coming in, I'd be very surprised if that happens. If it is more likely a start of the next year now, next calendar year, and that leaves us to submission to or introduction to Parliament, expected to be in summer 25, there or thereabouts, and then a prediction 26-27 is the working assumption for GBR stand up. It's the point for me to remind people, and there's a recurring theme here, that the legislation GBR stand up is pretty important, that's for sure, and it is required to create GBR and it is required to formally, rather than sort of the informal SGBR environment we have at the moment, but putting the accountability for the operating contract in the same place as the infrastructure outcomes for the railway. So that's the true collection together of the direct in mind point. But that isn't you don't have to get there to make a lot of the improvements we're trying to make in the meantime. And that's very much the theme behind what we've talked about. And that's the task that SGBR have been given to try and make that difference in the meantime in particular. Which then leads me into my final slide. So Secretary of State gave 5 key priorities to that SGBR group, that collective of those 3 organisations plus the chair subsequently appointed. The one that everybody would expect, passenger focused, improved services on the left hand side. That's very much about improving performance, trying to reverse the trend we're seeing in some places at the moment of declining performance, and get that better customer service in that foundation, which will then lead to improved revenue as well, better quality service. Second one around unblocking barriers to delivery. That is things like the industrial relations challenges, which of course some elements of that were sorted out fairly quickly. But then also things like the fares ticketing and retail activity. Some of the progress of that struggled in the previous environment because of the organisations not necessarily being all part of the decision making associated with it. It is now getting a good head of steam, and we'll start to see some of the deployment around those things to make, again, customer service better, customers offer better, particularly in the fares ticketing and retail space. Financial sustainability, the third one there, again, unsurprisingly, it's around getting a handle on the finances across the board rather than just the individual component parts through that transitionary period, particularly for the change period for the operators, in terms of contractual ownership and moving to DIHL, and then working consistently and repeatedly on trying to do what we can to either increase revenue, reduce costs to close that financial gap that we've got post the pandemic. Then critical component, designing an in-state GBR. Michelle's already talked through the process there. It's key, again, that point she made about it's GBR have got the accountability of designing GBR, but it's within a much wider environment as well. That sector target operating model, the department very much in that space too, and all the organisations across the industry involved in that overall sector operating model, with the target to get the GBR design through the accountability for the SGBR collective. And then that final one is very much about acting as a joined up organisation, so establishing the leadership of SGBR, creating that governance, that supervision, and what we're looking for is that improved decision making capability around visibility, whole system decision making. So we're seeing trials being set up in places where people are being supported in trying to make decisions differently. Again, that financial model right at the heart of it. So this is all about trying to do things differently. A quick caveat, not everything is included in those 5 priorities. They are very much short to medium term in nature. That was the intention of them, is to target what is happening now across that SGBR group. But other things are happening too that aren't mentioned there, such as a greater momentum behind transport planning, strategic planning. So we have people from GBRTT working closely with the department now about an integrated transport strategy that you would have seen a launch of, and I think a consultation exercise of last week, again, the previous Secretary of State. It's a recurring theme. Everybody recognises that we need to set this up founded upon a good quality strategy, long-term strategy, rail strategy, and wider transport strategy. That generally consensus is that doesn't exist or isn't as strong as it needs to be and should be. It isn't that at the moment. And back to the point about mayoral combined authorities too, if we're getting that balance right, back to that devolution bill that Michelle mentioned, underpinning that, a good strategy to understand what the local needs are to match in with the network needs and get that balance right, which is a core part of that journey for GBR. Having a good, robust and visionary, to an extent, strategy, data-driven, is key to that as well, because we'll be making some difficult trade-off decisions, as won't surprise anybody. I mean, particularly as demand is still continuing to increase, a lot of the bottlenecks and congestion points that we have in the network that we had before the pandemic, very much on my radar as a strategic planning lead in the south. They're back on the radar again, which is a great problem to have, but that will mean big and complicated trade-off decisions, and having a good strategy facilitates a sensible conclusion to that. So that is pretty much, gives us about 20 minutes or so, everything we wanted to run through. A big thank you for listening to us, and we'll see where that goes in terms of some questions. So I'll stop sharing. Back to you, Stuart.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. Great run through of where we've been and looking ahead to where we're going. So thank you both for that. In terms of questions, at the moment, I haven't got any questions that I can see on the chat. So, note to audience, if anybody would like to take the opportunity to raise questions now, please do. And I guess while we're just waiting for that, one for me in terms of risks, Michelle, you mentioned there's obviously a big risk management process going on with the whole implementation of a new organisation, etc. I just wonder, in terms of the stuff that keeps Great British Railways awake at night, in terms of the top risks, are they political based, safety, technical, financial? What are you able to sort of give us what you see as the main risk to actually this coming to fruition?
Well, certainly from the safety working group, the single biggest risk that we perceive at the moment is delay without momentum. So that's why it's really important that we keep talking about moving forward with the legislation, what that means, and communicating it. Because at the moment, we're concerned that people forget that they, have a role to play today. They are the duty holders. We don't want to take away current accountabilities and responsibilities. So we want people to keep focused on the here and now, the day-to-day operations, keeping it safe, operating performance, and so on. But equally, there is a risk that people will be distracted or potentially not making decisions. That's the other risk factor, is that people wait for GBR to come along. And obviously, we've had this roller coaster, as Paul and I have articulated several times today, that it's been a bit bumpy in the road. So we are keen to maintain momentum, get that legislation through.
So I think what you're telling me, it's political is the main issue, really, rather than all the stuff that we're used to dealing with from an engineering perspective.
Yeah, if I can just chip in here, Paul. I mean, you just sort of took the words back in my mouth. One thing I wrote down was that government influence point as well. It's a stated objective of the previous government and the current government to reduce the amount of government influence over decisions that the industry takes, which also supports it making some longer term decisions, because they've become very short term at the moment. That's a difficult thing to achieve. Stated objective, but very, very difficult. I've learned a lot over my years here in terms of working with the department and ministers. And it's a difficult thing to wean themselves off of. Again, not meant critically, just for reasons that it won't surprise anybody, particularly when large sums of money are being spent. So the political influence side of it, large sums of money being spent is a risk in its own right, because if the industry doesn't get itself into a different financial position, questions I suspect will be being asked. And the final one I wanted to mention was supply chain as well. I talked to enough organisations at the moment that said they are facing big challenges at the moment. Some of it linked to things like Network Rail's control period settlement and the startup of the next control period. Some of it linked to the hiatus that Michelle was alluding to of transition, where train operating companies are probably not making the decisions they used to around some of their supply chain based decisions, and that is creating pain in certain areas of the sector. We should turn it around. There's massive opportunity there as well if we get this right. Innovation, export capability and potential, it's all there for the taking if we can get it right, but I believe it's a big risk as well.
Okay, thank you. Well, I can see some questions come up now, but I can also see some hands going up. So I'll try and combine. One I can see is in both, is Jim. And Jim's asking, will GBR own the locomotives and rolling stock?
I'll go for that one. No, is the current assumption. So I'm not dismissing there being different models looked at some point in time in terms of what models set up for financing in particular and the procurement side of it. And then again, we've had a number of different models over the years as well. But the stated position at the moment is we're not doing anything different with than leasing the rolling stock as it currently stands. That's the assumed starting point.
Okay, thank you. That's pretty clear. Stuart Corrie asks, is there any expected or desired brain drain from the organisation or from these organisational changes?
Back to what Michelle said. I mean, I worry about a number of things from that point of view. If we go back to what I was saying just now about supply chain, lots of people are telling me that innovation and indeed project delivery and so on is easier overseas at the moment. That must be shifting focus, capability, and definitely innovation outside of the UK. So I worry about that. We've definitely got a challenge with the train operating companies. We know a lot of people on the call will have been through transitions between franchises over time, and that doesn't have such a big impact on the train operating company because it's only, even if it's a different owning group, a relatively small group of people affected by it. I think the worry is that there might be a greater range of people thinking they might be affected by this transition. Almost certainly there will be very few people affected by it in terms of transition from private sector to public sector, because the same rules apply. Effectively, people are running the railway. You want that, but the cultural shift associated with it, and probably nervousness in some people about it becoming a public sector from a private sector, may affect their desire to be in the industry. So there's a whole variety of factors that I worry about here. What we're trying to do is almost turn those around and get it into an environment where it should be more stimulated, people desiring, and it's one of my missions on the Derby side of it, is actually to work out how the industry works together to appeal to particularly younger generations, to go, this is a career choice for you, because there is a massive range of different opportunities and they're better joined up than ever before. So if you want to do anything from an engineer, customer service, technical specialist, finance person, all across the industry with a diverse range of needs and opportunities. So we get it turned around the other way. Railway 200 people will be aware of in terms of trying to celebrate both the history behind the railway and what that means going forward. I hope we can not only arrest that risk of brain drain, but certainly turn it into a better career choice for people.
Thank you.
I don't know if you wanted to throw anything in.
No, I'm with you, Paul. Having been very clear in my previous life in NR around training strategy, I think we'll really want to be sure that we've got people coming through the industry, development opportunities across all facets. So keen that we don't have a brain drain for sure.
Thanks.
Thank you. Paul Hooper, I can see you've raised your hand. Paul, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Thanks, Stuart. Thanks, Paul and Michelle. Really informative. Just a question more for Paul, I suspect, but either of you happy to answer. You talked in the vision about sustainability, but I didn't really hear anything about sustainability in the GBR-TT achievements or the sort of 5 priorities. Where does GBR going forward sit in terms of sustainability, making railway the choice for net zero, and any strides towards that? Can you enlighten us, please?
Yeah, sure. It's a really good observation. Part of it not featuring so much in the past was the fact that the decisions and inaction associated with them are probably broader than GBR-TT had any control or reach over. It's not for want of trying, because we founded GBR-TT, the team. Actually, some of the core members of the team originally were the Network Rail strategy team, who brought with them the vision for decarbonisation strategy. So that's, again, it's slanted a little bit. It won't surprise anybody that the run up to an election is not the time that people are having long-term visionary conversations, but it's very much warmed up again now. So, and I know it's not always all about decarbonisation of rolling stock and traction and so on, but it is quite a good representation of the criticality within which it's being treated, and it is very much back on the radar and gathering momentum now too. So I guess I don't think it was ever going to be an early win highlight of GBR-TT, albeit focusing around the system criticality and the interface associated with it is, because the system's got to work together to make those decisions. I've been stuck for years between the rolling stock, the electrification, the different modes type choices, and the need, because there's going to be investment behind any one of those decisions, for a bit of clarity and direction. So you need that strategic direction out of it. I think it's gathering momentum now, very much so. But it's the proof is going to be in the eating. It's implicit in that question, and I'm not seeing it. I am talking to lots of organisations that are telling me, I don't really mind what the decision is, just make a decision about the direction of travel. And we're to do that efficiently, which is, again, behind your point, is more likely to put it on the government's agenda for and policy for. That's part of our UK decarbonisation, is to get people to use rail. It is one of the things I point out regularly about railway can be a little insular in relations with those devolved bodies, but actually what most, in fact, all mayors and mayoral combined authorities we've been talking to want an integrated public transport system that is easy to use, good quality information, easy to make buying decisions around. To me, particularly as they represent a large proportion of the electorate, that is a way to go to make a real difference. So not just the decarbonisation of the solutions that we provide, but also the decision making of people in the UK to use public transport as a solution. So yeah, it's a good challenge because it's not featured. I guess I never thought it was going to be an early win, but you've got to get that consistency of direction to make it really play through.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you very much for the question. Paul, too many Pauls today. So
You never have too many Pauls.
Well said, sir. Michael King raises an interesting question in terms of the terminology which you used during the presentation. Both mentioned directing mind and guiding mind, and Michael was sort of interested in understanding what you think the difference between that is and what it means to GBR.
I'll take that first, and then Paul, feel free to come in. So guiding mind was very much when we were talking in 2023 about an organisation that didn't anticipate a public ownership bill. So so that would have been where we were very much working more broadly with passenger operators, freight operators, open access, and so on. The change in direction from the Labour government in the Great British Moving documentation, very much the legislation will push towards a directing mind of GBR. So the rail reform will put firmly and squarely GBR in the role of a directing mind, and that was not anticipated in 2023. It is, to my mind, quite important because if you get the legislation right, you get into directing mind, which gives you the long-term strategic visioning and all the things that we've just talked about, whether that's decarb or whatever. So directing, I think, is a much more positive, opportunity for GBR.
Yeah, if I can just throw in, I mean, one of the things, the language was very, very important in the previous engagement I had with the likes of rail partners and the train operating companies, because they were fearful of it being, let's say, an infrastructure led, but certainly and not the train operating company owning groups having a very loud voice in the industry. So it was to try and achieve a balance in that front too, just behind some of the things that Michelle said. But that's of course different now, because it was always treading a fine line between losing some of the system benefits, but giving the commercial opportunity, which has innovation behind it as well, that the owning groups and operators were seeking.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks,
Tricia Fort, are you there? Would you like to unmute and ask your question? Hi, Tricia.
Hello. The question
Good afternoon,
is,
Tricia.
good afternoon.
Ask your question, please, Tricia.
The question is, sorry, how will GBR liaise and work with the Scottish Government, Transport Scotland and the nationalised ScotRail?
Okay, for that one first. I mean, I've got the regions and nations team at the moment, which has got a number of different elements to it, but so the nations side of it very much has working with Scotland and Wales as two sort of groups, two collectives in terms of the nations, both very different in terms of what their accountability is, their devolved accountability, and how they operate and what their vision is. That, be honest, the conversation with Wales recently has been stronger, and that's just because of the nature of where they're starting from, what they've got, what their aspirations are. Scotland has been less progressive at the moment in terms of we haven't made much progress, not a problem with it. But that's really warming up again as we're getting closer to the legislative path. So that's where there will always have to be a very strong relationship. I've seen a document that, as usual, talks about a number of different options for how that could work, with GBR providing services to Transport Scotland in some way, shape or form. Often you're having conversations about how much separation there could be, then you get back to that network benefits lost and a whole variety of elements there too. So there will always need to be ongoing engagement. It'll need to be set up in a way that works for Scotland in its great full entity, and creates and enables the benefits out of GBR that is sought. But that conversation won't stop, and it will certainly be warming up again with that legislation conversation on the horizon. hopefully reassuring,
Okay.
Tricia. If it doesn't provide an answer necessarily to how we'll end up, but I really don't know. But quite strong views there, and quite a lot of alignment and agreement as well.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Tricia. I've got a question from Ahmed, who says, how will the transition impact the existing arrangements, engagement and relationship with the supply chain? Are there any expectations of a new vision around this?
Hopefully all positive. Although I sometimes get a bit carried away about positivity. I mean, one of the things we've listened, it's back to one of Michelle's point about risks, is no hiatus. So it was a very clear signal. I remember talking to somebody from RIA a while ago. Please, 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 they said, do not create an accidental or intentional hiatus in procurement activity and progression and implementation of work. So that's been heard loud and clear. Don't do anything that harms it, the relationship, the sector as a whole. That always then brings back that risk of, well, what are you going to do differently then? Because there's a lead time, it's complicated, and if you don't do anything different, you don't sort of, don't break an egg, don't make an omelette type statement. But we're still very, very clear on that overriding principle of don't break anything, particularly with the supply chain situation in a lot of cases being fragile at the moment. There should be the new vision, I guess, since I've alluded to a bit, we should have an environment that enables certainly innovation to be better deployed, quantified, enabled. I'm always very careful. I don't want to use the word drive innovation, because that sounds like the client is arrogant and knows what the right solutions are. The sector should be very good at innovating in its own right. So some of the focus will be, particularly using some of the new procurement legislation potentially as a vehicle for that, creating a better environment for that innovation to progress and get that value chain working, because that's the other point too there for me. It's oversimplifying it, but the more technology there is innovation, the harder it seems to work within a very rule-based environment around accountabilities, contracts. Technology requires a softer environment to work within. We should be able to enable that as well fairly quickly going forward, particularly with SGBR, particularly on a trial basis if necessary, and then when we get to a GBR environment. So it should be good. Always cautious about the not stopping things that we've got underway because it's too sensitive for that, and get a better environment. Michelle, any thoughts on?
No, sorry, Paul. I was just going to answer one of the other questions as regards HS2, conscious of time, and about the overview of a whole strategic network. So I was about to reply that we have a new Secretary of State who will inevitably want to take stock, take a view as to where we're going with HS2 and various other major programs. So I think watch this space. We don't know is the honest answer, as is always the case when we get a new Secretary of State. They need a couple of weeks to be brought up to speed, and that's what will be happening between now and Christmas. And we'd anticipate that the direction of travel in the new year would be announced very clearly for us as to whether we anticipate what happens in that space. In terms of long-term strategic planning, as Paul said, GBRTT has had long-term strategic planners and thinkers in its department. We now are working much more closely with DFT, and indeed collaborating to the point that we are now on the integrated transport program and so on. So I think it is a good time to be involved in that long-term thinking. I think we've got a chance to influence that, but as I say, with the new Secretary of State, we just have to wait for her decision as to what she sees fit for HS2 particularly.
Thank you, Michelle. Well, with a brilliant management of timing somehow or other, I think we've got to the end of the questions, which you've answered. And Michelle, you've had a go at a couple of questions that you can see in the chat. So thank you very much for that. And that gets us to the bottom. So that's brilliant. And thank you, both of you, for a really informative presentation. It's really great to get this sort of information from the horse's mouth, so to speak, people involved in the process and how it's going. So you get a bit of warts and all, which I think is great. So really appreciate you sort of putting it all on the line for us today and giving an update. And I look forward to, well, what should we call it, 12 months time, when perhaps we have a reprise, and let's see what's happened in that 12 months. I guess that's a rhetorical question, but yes. What I would say is we do have a dedicated LinkedIn channel for each of our lunch and learns. So if there is anything that anybody would like to raise that they didn't today, we can still communicate and still get answers and still follow issues through. So you'll find that on the PWI website and on our LinkedIn channel. So that's available. Just a quick reminder of, if we all come back on the 7th of January after a very good Christmas, you can then have a presentation on something very, very different, hedgehog sleepers. I think we've gone from the vast to the, let's say, slightly smaller component. But so thank you very much. Really appreciate you coming on today. And everybody, given it's our last lunch and learn before Christmas, I hope you all have a fantastic festive time, a happy new year, and all of you working on the railway, please stay safe. And I look forward to travelling on new bits of kit come January. Thank you very much,
Thanks,
everybody.
Stuart.